Welcome to our channel. Here, you'll discover surprising stories that spark your curiosity and move your heart. Make sure to subscribe for more high-quality content just like this. And now, let's get into the video. A routine traffic stop, a trembling hand against tinted glass, and a police dog that refused to leave the passenger window of a luxury sedan. What happened in the next 60 seconds would expose a truth no one saw coming. Officer Marcus Webb had been patrolling the interstate corridor for 11 years. He'd seen everything. Drunk drivers weaving through lanes at 3 in the morning. Teenagers racing stolen vehicles. Families arguing so loudly he could hear them through closed windows. But nothing in his career had prepared him for the morning of October 7th, when his canine partner, a Belgian Malinois named Kai, locked onto something Marcus couldn't see. The silver Mercedes had been doing 43 in a 65 zone, drifting slightly over the center line. Standard indicators. Marcus flipped on his lights, expecting the usual routine. License, registration, maybe a warning. The car pulled over smoothly, too smoothly, onto the shoulder beneath a canopy of oak trees that filtered the autumn sunlight into fragments of gold and shadow. Marcus radioed in the plate number and stepped out of his cruiser. Kai at his side, ears forward, body tense. The driver was a man in his mid-30s, clean-cut, wearing a polo shirt and cock. He rolled down the window before Marcus reached it, smiling in that careful way people do when they're trying very hard to appear calm. His hands were at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Textbook compliance. "Morning, officer," the man said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something Marcus couldn't name yet. Was I speeding? I didn't think I was speeding. License and registration, please. The man reached slowly into the glove compartment, every movement deliberate, and handed over the documents. Marcus glanced at them. Dylan Hartnett, addressed in Riverside, about 40 miles south. The registration matched the vehicle. You were driving under the limit. Actually, Marcus said, and you crossed the center line twice in the last mile. You feeling all right? Any medications? Alcohol? No, sir. Just tired. Long drive. Marcus nodded, still scanning, and that's when Kai moved. Not aggressively, but with purpose. The dog walked past Marcus, past the driver's window, and stopped at the rear passenger window. His tail went rigid, his nose pressed against the glass, and he didn't move. "Kai, here." The dog ignored him. That never happened. Kai was trained to the minute, responsive to every command, but now he stood frozen, focused, his breathing quick and shallow. Marcus felt the hair on his arms prickle. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." The driver's smile tightened. "Is there a problem?" "Just step out, please." The man hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but Marcus caught it. Then he opened the door and stood, hands visible, posture none threatening. Marcus moved toward the back of the car. The rear windows were tinted, dark enough that he couldn't see inside clearly. He motioned for Kai to back up, but the dog stayed planted. "Is there anyone else in the vehicle?" "No," Dylan said quickly. "Just me." Marcus looked at Kai. The dog's eyes hadn't left the window. 11 years on the force had taught Marcus to trust his partner's instincts over any human's words. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I'm going to need backup at mile marker 73, northbound lane." "Possible." And then he saw it. A hand, pale, thin, pressing against the inside of the glass. Not waving, not knocking, just there, fingers splayed, trembling, and then it was gone. The room froze. Everything in Marcus's body went cold and sharp. "Sir, open the back door." "Now, officer, I really don't open it, or I will." Dylan's face changed. The mask slipped. Something desperate flickered across his features, and for a moment Marcus thought he might run, but then the man reached back slowly and pulled the rear door handle. The door swung open, and Marcus saw her, an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, sitting upright in the back seat. She wore an expensive cream-colored blouse, pearl earrings, and her silver hair was perfectly styled, but her eyes were wide, terrified, and her mouth was covered with duct tape. Her wrists were bound with zip ties in her lap. She looked at Marcus, and in that gaze was every unspoken scream, every desperate prayer. Kai moved forward, whining softly, and the woman's eyes filled with tears. Marcus's hand went to his weapon. "Hands behind your head." "Now." Dylan complied, but his voice came out ragged. "You don't understand. You don't know what's happening. On your knees. She's not who you think she is." Marcus didn't respond. He cuffed Dylan and called for immediate backup, for an ambulance, for every unit within 10 miles. Then he knelt beside the woman, carefully peeling the tape from her mouth. She gasped, coughing, and the first words she spoke were not a cry for help, but a whisper. "He took me," he said. "No one would believe me. He said I was nothing. If you've ever felt invisible, you know what it means when someone finally sees you." That moment changed everything for this woman and for the officer who refused to look away. Marcus helped her out of the car, Kai pressing gently against her leg, and she collapsed against the side of the vehicle, sobbing. Not from relief, from something deeper. From the weight of hours spent believing no one would come, believing she had been erased. Within minutes, 3 more patrol cars arrived, sirens cutting through the quiet morning. Paramedics surrounded the woman, checking her vitals, asking gentle questions. Dylan Hartnett was placed in the back of a cruiser, silent now, staring at nothing. And Marcus stood beside Kai, his hand resting on the dog's head, trying to process what had just unfolded. He had stopped the car expecting a routine warning. Instead, he had found something far darker, but the real Stortha, one that would break his heart and redefine everything he thought he knew about justice was only beginning. Her name was Evelyn Carrington. She had been missing for 16 hours. Marcus learned this from the database check that came through minutes after the arrest. Evelyn Carrington, 73 years old, widow of real estate magnate Thomas Carrington, reported missing by her housekeeper at 9 o'clock the previous evening. The missing persons alert had gone out across 3 counties, but no one had expected to find her on a highway 40 miles from her estate, bound and terrified in the back of a stranger's car. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of his cruiser, reading the report on his laptop while Kai rested in the back, still alert, still watching. Evelyn had last been seen leaving a charity luncheon in the early afternoon. She'd told her driver she wanted to walk the 2 blocks to her favorite bookstore. She never arrived. Her phone was found in a trash can 3 streets away. Screen shattered. No witnesses, no surveillance footage. It was as if she had vanished into thin air until Kai found her. The paramedics had taken Evelyn to County General for evaluation, and Marcus knew he'd need to get her statement soon. But something gnawed at him. Dylan Hartnett had no prior record, no history of violence, no outstanding warrants. He worked as a financial consultant, lived in a modest apartment, paid his taxes. On paper, he was nobody. So why had he taken one of the wealthiest women in the state? Ransom seemed obvious, But Dylan hadn't made any demands. He'd been driving her north, away from the city, toward rural backroads, where a person could disappear forever. Marcus closed the laptop and looked out at the highway. The sun was higher now, traffic moving steadily past the scene. Normal people going about normal days, unaware that a woman's life had just been saved by a dog's instinct and a cop's willingness to trust it. He thought about that hand on the glass. How easily he could have missed it. How easily he could have waved Dylan on with a warning and never known. The thought made his stomach turn. 2 hours later, Marcus sat across from Evelyn in a private room at the hospital. She had refused sedation. She wanted to talk. She'd told the nurses neither to talk, as if holding the story inside any longer would destroy her. She looked small in the hospital bed, her cream blouse replaced with a standard gown, but her eyes were sharper now, focused. Kai lay at Marcus's feet, and Evelyn's gaze kept drifting to the dog, something like gratitude softening her features. "He heard me," she said quietly. "Your dog." I couldn't make any noise, but he heard me. Marcus leaned forward, notepad in hand. "Mrs. Carrington, I need you to walk me through what happened. Start from when you left the luncheon." She nodded, taking a slow breath. Her hands were bandaged where the zip ties had cut into her wrists. "I left the Grandmont Hotel around 1. I told Robert, my driver, that I wanted to walk to Callaway's books. It's something I do often. I like the air, the movement. I don't like feeling trapped in cars." Her voice wavered slightly. "Irony, I suppose. Take your time." I was 2 blocks away when a man approached me. He was polite, well-dressed. He said he recognized me from a foundation event. He asked if I remembered him. She paused, her jaw tightening. "I didn't. But I've met so many people over the years, I thought perhaps I'd forgotten." He said his name was Dylan. He said he had a business proposal, something he'd been hoping to discuss with me. He seemed ... harmless. "Educated?" Marcus wrote quickly. And then he asked if I'd sit with him for a moment, just 5 minutes, in his car. He said he had documents to show me, that it would be easier than standing on the street. I hesitated, but he was so earnest. So numb. I thought, her voice broke. I thought I was being kind. The silence that followed was heavier than truth. Marcus had seen this pattern before. Predators who understood that wealth and status didn't make someone immune to loneliness, to the desire to be seen as approachable, human. Evelyn had been targeted precisely because she was trying not to be the untouchable rich woman. She had wanted to be gracious. When I got in the car, Evelyn continued, her voice steadier now. He drove for maybe 30 seconds. Then he pulled into an alley. I didn't understand at first. I asked him what he was doing. He didn't answer. He just took out a roll of duct tape and zip ties. I tried to open the door, but he'd engaged the child locks. I screamed, but he covered my mouth so fast she stopped, pressing her hand to her chest. He told me to be quiet. He said if I cooperated, I wouldn't get hurt, but if I made noise, if I tried anything, he'd make sure I regretted it. Then he bound my wrists and taped my mouth and put me in the back seat. He covered me with a blanket. I couldn't see where we were going. I just felt the car moving, turning, stopping. Hours passed. I didn't know if it was Ransom, or if he planned to. She couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus's pen hovered over the page. Did he say anything else? Any indication of why he took you? Evelyn looked at him, and something dark flickered in her eyes. He said, He said I had taken something from him. He said people like me always take, and people like him always lose. He said it was time to balance the scales. Marcus felt a chill run through him. This wasn't random. This was personal. Did he explain what you'd supposedly taken? No. I'd never seen him before in my life. She shook her head slowly. I don't know what I could have done. My husband handled the business. I run charities. I give away more than I keep. But he looked at me like I was responsible for everything wrong in his life. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, you understand the helplessness she felt. It's the kind of injustice that stays with you long after the moment passes. Marcus closed his notepad. Mrs. Carrington, you're safe. Now, we have him in custody, and he's not getting out. She nodded, but her expression didn't change. I kept thinking no one would find me, that I'd just disappear, that my life, everything I'd done, would end in the back of a stranger's car, and no one would know. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Until your dog knew. Marcus reached down and scratched Kai behind the ears. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. He's good at his job. Evelyn smiled, just barely. He saved my life. But as Marcus left the hospital and drove back to the station, he couldn't shake the feeling that this case was far from over. Dylan Hartnett's words echoed in his mind. People like me always lose. What had Evelyn or her late husband taken from him? The interrogation room at the county precinct was small, fluorescent lit, and deliberately uncomfortable. Dylan Hartnett sat across from Marcus, his hands cuffed to the table, his earlier composure completely shattered. He looked like a man who had built a house of cards and watched it collapse in real time. His eyes were re-rimmed, his jaw tight, and when Marcus sat down across from him, Dylan didn't look up. Marcus set a folder on the table, but didn't open it. He let the silence stretch, watching. Silence was a tool, and most people couldn't stand it. Dylan lasted 43 seconds before he spoke. I didn't hurt her. His voice was hoarse. I didn't lay a hand on her. I just needed her to listen. You kidnapped a 73-year-old woman, Marcus said evenly. You bound her wrists, taped her mouth, and drove her to God knows where. You don't get to call that listening. Dylan's hands clenched into fists. You don't know what she did, what her family did. Then tell me. For a long moment, Dylan said nothing. Then he looked up, and the expression on his face was raw, unfiltered. 10 years ago, Thomas Carrington bought the company my father spent 30 years building. He promised the employees they'd keep their jobs, that nothing would change. 6 months later, he liquidated everything, sold off the assets, closed the offices, and walked away with $40 million. 300 people lost their livelihoods. My father lost everything. Marcus kept his expression neutral. I'm sorry that happened to your father. But Evelyn Carrington wasn't responsible for her husband's business decisions. She lived off the money. Dylan's voice rose, sharp and bitter. She spent it, donated it to her charities, smiled for the cameras, while people like my father couldn't afford rent. He had a heart attack 2 years later. Stress, the doctor said. He died bankrupt and broken, and she got to keep living in her mansion, throwing galas, pretending she was some kind of saint. Marcus leaned back in his chair. He'd heard variations of this story 100 times. Pain turned into anger, anger into justification. So you've decided to take revenge? I decided to make her see. Dylan's voice cracked. I just wanted her to understand what it feels like to lose everything, to be invisible, to scream and have no one hear you. By kidnapping her, I wasn't going to kill her. I just wanted her to feel what my father felt, to sit with that fear, that helplessness. And then I was going to let her go, I swear. Marcus studied him. There was a desperate sincerity in Dylan's eyes, but sincerity didn't change the facts. Where were you taking her? Dylan looked down. There's an old cabin my family used to own up near the state forest. It's abandoned now. I was going to keep her there for a day, maybe 2. Let her sit with it. Then I'd leave her at a hospital. Anonymous. She'd be fine. Except she wouldn't be fine, Marcus said quietly. You traumatized her. You made her believe she was going to die. You do get to decide that it's acceptable because you're angry about what happened to your father. Dylan's jaw worked, but he didn't respond. Marcus opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of Evelyn in the back seat, her wrists bound, her eyes wide with terror. This is what you did. Look. It. Dylan glanced at the photo and flinched, turning his face away. I didn't mean yes. You did. You planned this. You bought the zip ties, the duct, tape. You followed her routine until you found an opening. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. You chose this. The words hit like stones, and Dylan crumpled, his head dropping forward, his shoulders shaking. I just wanted someone to care. I wanted someone to acknowledge what happened to him. But no one did. No one ever does. The rich get richer, and people like us just disappear. Marcus let the silence settle again. He understood the pain Dylan was describing. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where people worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make rent, where the system felt rigged, where justice seemed like a luxury reserved for others. But understanding didn't mean excusing. Your father deserved better, Marcus said finally. I won't argue with that. But taking Evelyn Carrington wasn't justice. It was cruelty. And it didn't bring your father back. Dylan didn't respond. He just sat there, broken, staring at the table. Marcus stood, gathering the folder. You'll be charged with kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and assault. You're looking at serious time. Anazle. I don't think you'll find much sympathy. He left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Outside, Detective Laura Chen was waiting, arms crossed, watching through the one-way glass. Think he's telling the truth? She asked. About not planning to kill her. Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah. I think he's telling the truth, but that doesn't change what he did. Laura exhaled. Carrington Industries did gut that company. I remember the case. It was legal, but it wasn't pretty. A lot of people got hurt. A lot of people get hurt every day, Marcus said. Doesn't mean you get to hurt someone else in return. Laura nadat, but her expression was thoughtful. You ever wonder if people like Evelyn Carrington really know what the money costs? I don't know, Marcus admitted, but she knows now. That evening, Marcus returned to the hospital to check on Evelyn. She was sitting up in bed, her daughter beside her, a woman in her late 40s with the same sharp eyes and silver-streaked hair. They were talking quietly, and when Marcus knocked, Evelyn looked up and smiled faintly. Officer Webb. Please, come in. He stepped inside, Kai at his side. Evelyn's daughter stood and extended her hand. I'm Claire. Thank you for finding my mother. I don't know how to... She stopped, her voice breaking. Thank you. Marcus shook her hand. I'm glad we could help. Evelyn gestured to the chair beside the bed. Sit, please. I've been thinking about what happened. About him. Dylan Marcus sat, surprised. You've been thinking about your kidnapper. I've been thinking about his father. Evelyn's voice was calm, measured. I looked into it. Wallace Hartnett, my husband, bought his company in 2015. I remembered the acquisition. Thomas said it was a good deal. I didn't ask questions. I didn't think I needed to. She paused, her hands folding in her lap. But I should have. Claire looked at her mother, concern flickering across her face. Mom, you can't blame yourself for what Thomas did in business. Can't I? Evelyn's gaze was steady. I lived off that money. I spent it. I enjoyed the life it gave me. And I never once asked where it came from or who paid the price for it. Marcus didn't know what to say. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected. Dylan Hartnett made a choice to hurt you, he said carefully. That's on him, not you. Perhaps, Evelyn said, but I made choices too. I chose not to see, and maybe that's its own kind of violence. The room fell quiet. Outside, the hospital hummed with distant voices, footsteps, the steady beep of machines. Marcus thought about Dylan in the interrogation room, about the pain that had twisted into something dark. He thought about Evelyn, sitting in the back of a car, believing she had been erased. And he thought about all the invisible people, the ones whose stories never made the news, whose suffering went unnoticed until it exploded into something that couldn't be ignored. What will you do now? He asked. Evelyn looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something resolute in her eyes. I don't know yet, but I won't forget. And somehow, Marcus believed her. The case against Dylan Hartnett moved quickly. His confession, combined with the physical evidence and Evelyn's testimony, left no room for doubt. The district attorney charged him with first-degree kidnapping, aggravated assault, and unlawful restraint. His bail was set at $500,000, an amount his public defender argued was excessive, given that Dylan had no prior record and no flight risk. The judge disagreed. Dylan remained in county lockup awaiting trial. Marcus attended the bail hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom beside Laura Chin. He watched Dylan being led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his face pale and drawn. The man looked like a ghost of himself. When the judge read the charges aloud, Dylan didn't react. He simply stood there, staring at the floor as if he'd already accepted his fate. Evelyn was not present. Her lawyer had submitted a victim impact statement on her behalf, but she'd chosen not to appear in person. Marcus understood. Facing the man who had taken her freedom, even in a controlled environment, wasn't something everyone could do. But as he left the courthouse that afternoon, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Officer Webb, this is Evelyn Carrington. Would you be willing to meet me for coffee tomorrow? I'd like to speak with you about something important. Marcus stared at the message for a long moment, then typed a reply. Of course. Let me know where and when. They met at a small cafe on the east side of town, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Evelyn arrived before him, sitting at a corner table with a cup of tea in front of her. She looked different, outside the hospital stronger, more composed. She wore a simple navy dress and a silk scarf. And when she saw Marcus, she smiled and gestured to the seat across from her. Thank you for coming, she said. I know you're busy. Marcus sat down, ordering a black coffee from the server who appeared almost immediately. Kai lay at his feet, and Evelyn reached down to scratch the dog's ears. I've been thinking about him, she said quietly. Dylan. I can't stop thinking about him. Marcus wasn't sure how to respond, so he waited. I read about his father, Evelyn continued. Wallace Hartnett. I found news articles, interviews. He was a good man, by all accounts. Built his business from nothing. Employed people who couldn't find work elsewhere. treated them like family. And then my husband came along and took it all apart. She looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes. I didn't know. I want you to understand that. Thomas handled the business side of things. I ran the charitable foundations. We lived separate professional lives. But ignorance isn't innocence, is it? Marcus took a sip of his coffee, choosing his words carefully. You're not responsible for what Dylan did. No, Evelyn agreed, but I am responsible for how I respond now. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, setting it on the table between them. I've been looking into the employees who lost their jobs when Thomas liquidated Hartnett Industries. There were 312 people. Some found other work, some didn't. Some, like Wallace Hartnett, never recovered. She unfolded the paper, revealing a list of names. I want to do something. I want to set up a fund, offer restitution, job placement, assistance, whatever I can. I know it won't undo the damage. I know it won't bring Wallace back. But I can't just sit in my house and pretend it didn't happen. Marcus looked at the list, then back at Evelyn. That's a generous gesture. But you know it won't change the case, right? Dylan will still face charges. I know, Evelyn said, and what he did was wrong. But so was what my husband did. And I've spent 10 years benefiting from that without questioning it. I can't change the past, but I can try to do better now. There was something in her voice, determination, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion from carrying guilt she was only beginning to understand. Marcus thought about Dylan in that interrogation room, insisting that he just wanted someone to care. And here was Evelyn proving that someone could. I think it's a good thing you're doing, Marcus said finally. But be prepared for backlash. Not everyone will see it the way you do. Some people will say you're only doing this because you got caught up in the consequences. Evelyn nodded. I'm sure they will. But that's all right. I'm not doing this for optics. I'm doing it because it's right. They talked for another hour, Evelyn asking Marcus about the process, about how to reach the families, about what kind of support would be most meaningful. Marcus offered what guidance he could, though this was far outside his usual scope. When they finally parted ways, Evelyn shook his hand and thanked him again. You saved my life, she said. But more than that, you reminded me that I'm still here, that I still have time to make things right. Marcus watched her leave, climbing into the back of a black sedan where her driver waited. Then he walked back to his cruiser, Kai trotting beside him, and sat there for a long moment, staring out at the street. He thought about justice and what it really meant. The legal system would punish Dylan for his crime, and that was necessary. But Evelyn was trying to address a different kind of harm, one that the courts couldn't touch. He didn't know if it would work. He didn't know if the families would accept our help, or if the gesture would feel too little, too late. But he respected her for trying. 2 weeks later, Marcus received another call from Evelyn. She'd reached out to 15 of the former Hartnett Industries employees and their families. 10 had responded positively. 5 had refused to engage, their wounds still too raw. Evelyn was undeterred. She'd hired a team to help coordinate job training programs and financial assistance. She'd also written a personal letter to each family, acknowledging the harm caused and offering her sincere apologies. Some responded. Some didn't. Marcus kept track of the developments from a distance, more out of curiosity than professional obligation. The case was closed as far as he was concerned. Dylan would go to trial in 3 months, and Marcus would likely be called to testify. But the rest, the reconciliation, the restitution, the complicated tangle of blame and forgiveness, that was beyond his jurisdiction. Still, He found himself thinking about it late at night when the shift was quiet and the roads were empty. He thought about the randomness of it all. If he hadn't pulled Dylan over that morning, if Kai hadn't sensed something wrong, Evelyn would have disappeared into those backwoods, and Dylan would have remained a ghost, haunted by his father's death and his own unresolved rage. And maybe Evelyn would never have looked back at the life she'd been living, never questioned the foundation it was built on. One afternoon, Marcus took Kai to the park for a break. They walked along the trail, the late autumn sun filtering through the trees, and Marcus let his mind wander. He thought about the hand on the glass, about the moment everything shifted, about how close they'd come to missing it. Kai stopped to sniff at a patch of grass, tail wagging, completely present in the moment. Dogs didn't carry the weight of the past the way humans did. They just moved forward, alert to the now. Marcus envied that sometimes. When he got back to the station, there was a package waiting for him at the front desk. No return address, just his name written in elegant script. He opened it in his office. Inside was a framed photograph of Kai taken the day of the rescue. Beneath it, a small brass plaque read, "To Officer Marcus Webb and Kai, with gratitude for seeing what others missed. You gave me my life back. Evelyn Carrington." Marcus set the frame on his desk, beside the stack of case files and the coffee-stained reports. It didn't fit with the rest of the clutter, but somehow that felt right. A reminder that some cases stayed with you, not because of the crime, but because of what came after, because of the choices people made when they realized they still had time. The trial of Dylan Hartnett began on a cold morning in late November. The courthouse was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and a handful of former Hartnett Industries employees who had come to witness the proceedings. Marcus sat in the gallery, wearing his dress uniform, Kai at home for the day. He'd been subpoenaed to testify, and he knew the defense would try to paint Dylan as a victim of circumstance, a man driven to desperation by grief and injustice. They weren't wrong, exactly, but they also weren't right. The prosecution called Marcus to the stand on the second day. He walked to the front of the courtroom, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Angela Reyes, guided him through the events of October 7th with practiced efficiency. Marcus described the traffic stop, Kai's behavior, the moment he saw Evelyn's hand on the glass. He spoke clearly, factually, avoiding editorializing. When Angela asked him how Evelyn had appeared when he opened the door, Marcus paused. "Terrified," he said, simply. "She looked like someone who thought she was going to die." The courtroom was silent. Angela nodded and returned to her seat. Then the defense attorney stood. His name was Martin Cole, a public defender with 20 years of experience and a reputation for fighting hard for his clients. He approached the stand with a measured expression, neither hostile nor friendly. "Officer Webb, you've been on the force for 11 years, correct?" "Yes." "And in that time, how many traffic stops would you estimate you've conducted?" Marcus considered. "Thousands." "Thousands," Martin repeated. "And of those thousands, how many resulted in discovering a kidnapping victim?" One. So this was an extraordinary situation." "Yes," Martin paced slowly. "You testified that your canine partner, Kai, alerted you to something unusual about the vehicle. Can you explain exactly what that alert looked like?" Kai moved to the rear passenger window and wouldn't leave. His body language indicated he'd detected something significant. But he didn't bark. Didn't scratch at the door? No. Kai is trained to alert without aggression. So, to an outside observer, it might have just looked like a dog standing by a car, Marcus kept his expression neutral. Possibly. But I know my partner. I know what his alerts mean. Martin. And when you asked Mr. Hartnett to open the rear door, he complied immediately, didn't he? After a brief hesitation? Yes. But he didn't resist. Didn't try to flee? No. In fact, Mr. Hartnett cooperated fully with your instructions throughout the entire stop. Correct? Marcus saw where this was going. He cooperated after I discovered Mrs. Carrington. But he didn't fight you, didn't threaten you, didn't attempt to harm Mrs. Carrington in your presence. That's correct. Martin paused, letting the point settle. Officer Webb, during your interview with Mr. Hartnett, did he express remorse? He expressed regret about his father's situation. Did he tell you he hadn't intended to harm Mrs. Carrington? Yes. Did you believe him? The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Marcus considered the question carefully. I believed. He believed that, but intent doesn't erase harm. Martin smiled faintly. Thank you, Officer Webb. No further questions. Marcus stepped down, returning to his seat. The trial continued for another week. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, testimony from the paramedics who had treated Evelyn, and a psychological evaluation that painted Dylan as someone experiencing a prolonged grief response that had calcified into obsession. The defense countered with character witnesses who described Dylan as gentle, thoughtful, someone who had been destroyed by watching his father's decline. They argued that he had been driven to an irrational act by trauma, that he needed treatment, not incarceration. Evelyn took the stand on the fourth day. She wore a gray suit, her silver hair pulled back, and she answered every question with quiet precision. Yes, she had been terrified. Yes, she had believed she might die. Yes, Dylan had told her she represented everything wrong with the world. But when the defense asked if she believed Dylan would have killed her, Evelyn hesitated. I don't know, she said, finally. I'd like to think he wouldn't have, but I can't be certain. Martin Cole leaned forward. Mrs. Carrington, do you believe my client deserves compassion? Angela Reyes shot to her feet. Objection calls for speculation. The judge nodded. Sustained. But Evelyn answered anyway. I believe everyone deserves compassion, she said quietly, even people who hurt us. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge gavelled for order. Marcus watched Evelyn return to her seat, her daughter's hand on her shoulder, and he wondered if that answer would help or hurt Dylan's case. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Dylan stood as the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. He didn't react. He just stood there, expressionless, as if he'd known all along how this would end. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Marcus didn't attend, but he read the outcome in the newspaper. Dylan Hartnett was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with a possibility of parole after 8. The judge acknowledged the mitigating circumstances, his lack of prior record, his father's death, his cooperation, but emphasized that kidnapping was a serious crime that warranted serious consequences. Marcus folded the newspaper and set it aside. Justice, he supposed, but it felt incomplete, like closing a book without reading the last chapter. Have you ever wondered what happens to the people left behind after the headlines fade? Sometimes the real story is in what comes after, in the quiet work of rebuilding. If you've felt that way, drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Winter came early that year, bringing snow and ice that made the highways treacherous. Marcus and Kai worked overtime, responding to accidents, assisting stranded motorists, pulling people out of ditches, The work was exhausting, but it was also grounding. It reminded him why he'd become a cop in the first place. One evening, as he was finishing his shift, Marcus received a call from Evelyn. She sounded tired but determined. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that we've placed 42 people in new jobs. Another 15 are enrolled in training programs. It's not enough, but it's something." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "That's good work, Mrs. Carrington. Call me Evelyn, please. And it's not just my work. A lot of people are helping, I think." She paused. "I think Wallace Hartnett would have appreciated that." Marcus didn't know what to say to that, so he just listened. "Dylan's attorney reached out to me," Evelyn continued. "He said Dylan wanted to apologize. Wanted to know if I'd be willing to read a letter he'd written. Are you?" "I don't know," Evelyn admitted. "Part of me wants to. Part of me thinks it's too soon. But I keep thinking about what you said, about how intent doesn't erase harm. Maybe reading his letter won't erase what he did, but maybe it's a step toward understanding why." Marcus thought about that. "It's your choice. No one can tell you what's right." "I know," Evelyn said softly, "but I wanted to tell someone who might understand." They talked for a few more minutes, and when they hung up, Marcus sat in the quiet of his office, the framed photograph of Kai watching him from the desk. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, soft and steady, covering the world in white. Evelyn did read the letter. She told Marcus about it 3 weeks later, over coffee at the same small cafe. She handed him a folded piece of paper. Across the table, her expression unreadable. "He gave his attorney permission to share it with me," she said. "I thought you might want to see it." Marcus hesitated, then took the letter and unfolded it. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike in its precision. "Dear Mrs. Carrington, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything from you, honestly, but I need to say this, even if only for myself. What I did was wrong. I know that now. I knew it even then, if I'm being honest. But I was so angry, so consumed by the idea that someone needed to pay for what happened to my father, that I convinced myself I was justified. I told myself I was just making you understand, just holding up a mirror so you could see the consequences of your husband's choices. But that was a lie. I wanted you to suffer. I wanted you to feel powerless. And that makes me no better than the people I blamed for destroying my father. I've had a lot of time to think in here about my dad, about the choices I made, about what justice really means. My father wouldn't have wanted this. He would have been ashamed of me. He built his company on the belief that you treat people with dignity, no matter what, and I threw that away the moment I put those zip ties on your wrists. I don't know what else to say, except I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the fear I caused you. I'm sorry for making you feel invisible, erased. You didn't deserve that. No one does. I hope you can find peace, and I hope someday I can find a way to do the same. Dylan Hartnett. Marcus refolded the letter and handed it back to Evelyn. She slipped it into her purse, her hand steady. "What did you think?" she asked. "I think he means it," Marcus said, "but meaning it doesn't undo the harm." "No," Evelyn agreed, "but it's a start." They sat in silence for a moment, the cafe humming with quiet conversation around them. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "I've decided to write back." Marcus looked at her, surprised. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "I don't know if it's a good idea," Evelyn admitted, "but I think it's the right thing to do. Not for him. For me, I need to close this chapter, and I can't do that by pretending he doesn't exist." Marcus didn't argue. He'd learned over the years that healing looked different for everyone. Some people needed distance. Others needed confrontation, and some, like Evelyn, needed to find a way to acknowledge the harm without being consumed by it. "What will you say?" he asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "I'm not sure yet, but I'll figure it out." Over the next few months, Marcus followed the story from a distance. Evelyn's foundation continued its work, placing more former Hartnett Industries employees in new positions, offering financial assistance to those who needed it. Some of the families remained skeptical, unwilling to accept help from the woman who had benefited from their loss. But others were grateful, cautiously optimistic that something good could come from something terrible. Dylan remained in prison, serving his sentence without incident. According to his attorney, he'd enrolled in educational programs working toward a degree in social work. Whether that was genuine rehabilitation or simply a way to pass the time, Marcus couldn't say, but he hoped it was the former. Marcus himself returned to his routine. More traffic stops, more patrols, more nights spent driving through empty streets with Kai in the passenger seat. The case had changed him in small ways, made him more aware of the invisible people, the ones whose suffering went unnoticed until it exploded into violence. He found himself stopping more often to check on people, asking questions, listening. One evening in early spring, Marcus pulled over to assist a stranded motorist on the side of the highway. The man's car had broken down, and he was standing beside it, looking lost. Marcus ran the usual checks, finding nothing suspicious, and called for a tow truck. While they waited, the man started talking. He'd lost his job 6 months ago. His wife had left him. He was on his way to his sister's house, hoping to stay there until he got back on his feet. He didn't ask for help, didn't complain. He just talked, and Marcus listened. When the tow truck arrived, Marcus handed the man a card for a local job placement. Program one of the ones Evelyn S. Foundation had helped fund. The man looked at the card, then at Marcus, and something in his expression shifted. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do that. It's just a card," Marcus said, "but maybe it'll help." The man nodded and climbed into the tow truck. Marcus watched them drive away, Kai's head resting on his lap, and he thought about the small moments that changed lives. The hand on the glass, the dog that wouldn't leave, the decision to pull over, to ask questions, to care when it would have been easier not to. He thought about Evelyn writing letters to a man who had kidnapped her, about Dylan sitting in a cell trying to make sense of the wreckage he'd created, about all the people caught in the spaces between justice and mercy, punishment and redemption. There were no easy answers, no clean resolutions, just people trying to do better, one choice at a time. That summer, Marcus was promoted to sergeant. The ceremony was small, just a few colleagues and his family. Kai sat at his feet, wearing a ceremonial vest, and when the chief pinned the new badge to Marcus's uniform, the room erupted in applause. Afterward, Marcus received a card in the mail. It was from Evelyn. Inside, she'd written, "Congratulations on your promotion. You've earned it. Thank you for reminding me that we all have the power to see each other, even when it would be easier to look away. With gratitude, Evelyn Carrington." Marcus tucked the card into his desk drawer, beside the framed photograph of Kai. He didn't know if Evelyn had ever sent her letter to Dylan. He didn't know if Dylan had responded, but he hoped they'd both found some measure of peace, because that, he'd learned, was what justice really looked like. Not just punishment, but the hard, messy work of trying to make things right. Later that week, Marcus took Kai to the training facility for a routine research. The dog performed flawlessly, as always, responding to every command with precision. When the session ended, Marcus knelt beside Kai, scratching him behind the ears. "Good boy," he said. "You're a good boy." Kai's tail wagged, his eyes bright, and Marcus felt a surge of gratitude for this animal who had saved a woman's life simply by trusting his instincts. Sometimes, Marcus thought, the most important thing you could do was pay attention to the hand on the glass, to the voice that couldn't speak, to the person standing in front of you, hoping to be seen. He stood, clipping the leash to Kai's collar, and together they walked back to the cruiser. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and the world felt, for a moment, like a place where things could still be made right, where people could still choose kindness over cruelty, where a dog's instinct and a cop's willingness to trust it could change the course of a life. Marcus climbed into the driver's seat, Kai settling in beside him, and pulled out onto the road. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But tonight, he allowed himself to believe it mattered. 3 years passed. The world kept turning, seasons changing, people moving through their lives with the strange mixture of intention and accident that defines human existence. Marcus continued his work as a sergeant, training new officers, conducting patrols, and responding to the calls that came through dispatch with increasing frequency. Crime hadn't stopped. Suffering hadn't ended. But he approached each day with a little more awareness, a little more willingness to see beyond the surface. Kai, now 10 years old, had slowed slightly. The dog still worked, still performed his duties with dedication. But there was a gentleness to his movements now, a wisdom that came with age. Marcus knew their time together was finite, that eventually he'd have to retire Kai and bring in a new partner. But he wasn't ready for that yet. Neither of them were. The bond between them had deepened over the years, becoming something that transcended the typical handler-canine relationship. They understood each other in ways that required no words, no commands, just presence. One afternoon in late autumn, Marcus received an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "A conversation, if you're willing." He opened it, expecting spam or perhaps a routine inquiry from another department. Instead, he found something entirely unexpected. "Officer Webb, my name is Dylan Hart. I'm writing from the State Correctional Facility where I'm serving my sentence. I know you have no reason to respond to this message. I know I have no right to ask for your time. But if you're willing, I'd like to speak with you. Not about the Kastats done, and I've accepted responsibility for what I did, but about something else. Something I've been working on that I hope might make a difference." "I understand if you decline, but I thought I'd try." Dylan Hartnett. Marcus read the email twice, then leaned back in his chair, the old leather creaking beneath his weight. He hadn't thought about Dylan in months. The case had closed. The sentence had been served partially. At least Dan life had moved forward in the way it always does, relentlessly, indifferently. But something in the email gave him pause. Not the words themselves, but the tone. There was no manipulation, no plea for sympathy, no attempt to minimize what had happened. Just a simple request from one human being to another. He thought about it for 2 days before responding, weighing the potential complications, the emotional cost, the question of whether engaging with Dylan would help or hurt. In the end, his curiosity won out, along with something deeper, a belief that people deserve the chance to try to be better, even after they'd been at their worst. "Dylan, I'm willing to meet. Let me know when, and I'll arrange it." Marcus Webb. 2 weeks later, Marcus drove to the State Correctional Facility, Kai in the back seat. The dog wouldn't be allowed inside, but Marcus liked having him along. It felt right somehow to have his partner present for this journey, even if he'd have to wait in the vehicle. The prison was a sprawling complex of gray concrete and chain-link fences, surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon under a pale autumn sky. Marcus checked in at the front desk, went through security emptying his pockets, walking through the metal detector, signing the visitor S-log, and was escorted to a small visiting room with a table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. The walls were painted a institutional beige that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who looked at it too long. Dylan was brought in a few minutes later, escorted by a guard who positioned himself by the door. Dylan looked different, thinner, older, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. His prison-issue clothing hung loosely on his frame, and his hair had started to gray at the temples. But there was something else to something steadier in his posture, less frantic. The desperate energy that had surrounded him during the arrest and trial had been replaced by something calmer, Mari grounded. He sat down across from Marcus and folded his hands on the table, his movements careful and deliberate. "Thank you for coming," Dylan said, his voice rougher than Marcus remembered. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," Marcus admitted, studying the man across from him. "But I'm here. So, talk." Dylan nodded, taking a deep breath before beginning. "I've been working with a program here. It's called Restorative Circles. It's about taking responsibility for harm, understanding the impact of your actions, and finding ways to make amends, not to erase what you did, but to try to do something constructive going forward, something that might prevent others from making the same mistakes." Marcus listened, his expression neutral, giving nothing away. He'd heard rehabilitation pitches before, seen inmates try to convince themselves and others that they'd changed. Some were genuine. Many weren't. "We've been developing a curriculum," Dylan continued, leaning forward slightly, his hands still folded. "Something that could be used in schools, community centers, places where people are struggling. It focuses on addressing grief, anger, and trauma in healthy ways before they escalate into violence. I've been working with a psychologist here, Dr. Ramirez, and we think it could help. Really help. Not everyone, maybe, but some people. And if it helps even one person avoid the path I took, ... double quotes." He paused, meeting Marcus's eyes directly. "I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to review it. You see this stuff every day? You know what works and what doesn't on the streets, in real situations. I value your perspective more than anyone else's." Marcus studied him, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving motivation. "Why me?" "Because you saw me at my worst," Dylan said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "And you treated me like a human being anyway. You didn't excuse what I did, but you didn't demonize me either. When you interviewed me, you listened. You heard me. And I need that kind of honesty if this is going to mean anything. I don't need someone to tell me I'm doing great just because I'm trying. I need someone who'll tell me the truth about whether this work has value." Marcus considered the request, feeling the weight of it. Part of him wanted to say no, to walk away and leave this chapter closed, sealed, finished. The case was done. Justice had been served. There was no professional obligation to engage further. But another part, the part that believed people could change, that redemption was possible even after terrible choices, wanted to see what Dylan had created. Wanted to know if 3 years in prison had genuinely transformed him, or if this was just another performance. "Send me the materials," Marcus said finally. "I'll take a look." "No promises beyond that. That's all I'm asking," Dylan said, and something like relief washed across his features. "Thank you. Really. Thank you." They talked for another 30 minutes, the conversation gradually becoming less formal, more human. Dylan asked about Kai, about the work, about how things had changed since the case. Marcus kept his answers brief but honest, sharing small details about his life without revealing anything too personal. He learned that Dylan had earned his GED in prison, that he'd been reading ostensibly philosophy, psychology, memoirs of people who'd overcome trauma, that he'd started corresponding with some of the families affected by his father's company's closure, not to make excuses, but to understand their experiences more fully. When the time was up and the guard indicated they needed to wrap up, they shook hands across the table. Dylan's grip was firm, his eyes clear. "Whatever you decide," Dylan said. "I'm grateful you came." Marcus left the facility, climbing back into his cruiser where Kai waited patiently, the dog's tail immediately beginning to wag at the sight of him. Marcus scratched him behind the ears, feeling the familiar warmth of the animal's presence. "What do you think, buddy?" "People capable of change." Kai just looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes, patient and trusting in the way only dogs can be. Marcus smiled despite himself. "Yeah, me too." The curriculum arrived via email a week later, accompanied by a brief note from Dylan thanking him again for his willingness to review the materials. Marcus spent an evening reviewing it, coffee growing cold beside him, Kai asleep at his feet, the dog's gentle snoring providing a comforting rhythm to his reading. The materials were thoughtful, well-researched, and surprisingly practical. They focused on emotional literacy, teaching people to recognize and name their feelings, conflict resolution strategies that didn't rely on violence or dominance, and understanding the roots of anger and how trauma manifests in behavior. There were exercises for identifying triggers, strategies for de-escalation that anyone could use, and frameworks for taking accountability that didn't shame people but instead encouraged growth. It wasn't perfect. Some sections felt overly academic, using language that would be inaccessible to many of the people who needed these tools most. Others felt too simplistic, reducing complex emotional situations to bullet points and worksheets. But the core ideas were solid, and more importantly, they were grounded in lived experience. Dylan had taken his own mistakes, his own journey from grief to rage to imprisonment, and tried to build something that might prevent others from making the same ones. Marcus sent back detailed note suggestions for clarifying certain exercises, ideas for making the language more accessible and culturally relevant, connections to existing community resources that could supplement the curriculum. Dylan responded quickly with gratitude and more questions, eager to refine and improve. Over the next few months, they exchanged emails sporadically, refining the curriculum section by section. Marcus introduced Dylan to a colleague who worked with at-risk youth in the city's toughest neighborhoods. That colleague, impressed by the materials, connected Dylan with a nonprofit focused on violence prevention that had been looking for exactly this kind of resource. Slowly, carefully, the project began to take shape beyond the prison walls, moving from theory into potential practice. Marcus didn't advertise his involvement. This wasn't about him, wasn't about getting credit or recognition, but he watched from a distance as the program found footing, as organizations expressed interest, as people who had been hurt by violence, both as victims and perpetrators, saw value in Dylan's work. It wasn't redemption, exactly. Dylan would still serve his time. He'd still carry the weight of what he'd done to Evelyn, the terror he'd caused, the trauma he'd inflicted. Nothing could undo that, but it was something, a way forward that acknowledged the past without being consumed by it, that refused to accept that one terrible act defined the entirety of a person's worth. One evening, as winter approached and the days grew shorter, Marcus received a call from Evelyn. They hadn't spoken in over a year, though he'd seen occasional news articles about her foundation's work scholarship programs, job placement initiatives, mental health services for families affected by economic hardship. Marcus, I hope I'm not interrupting, she said. Her voice was warm, familiar, carrying none of the tremor that had been present in those first conversations after the kidnapping. Not at all. How are you, Evelyn? I'm well, busy, but well. The foundation keeps me occupied. She paused. I'm calling because I heard about the curriculum, the one Dylan's been working on. Marcus was surprised. He deliberately kept his involvement quiet, had asked Dylan not to mention his name in any promotional materials. How did you hear about that? One of the nonprofits my foundation funds is piloting it, Evelyn explained. They didn't tell me who developed it initially, but when I looked into it more closely, when I saw the name attached, I recognized it. Small world, isn't it? It is, Marcus agreed, wondering where this conversation was headed. Have you reviewed the materials yourself? I have. They're good. Really good. Evelyn's voice carried genuine admiration. I'd like to support the program. Financially, I mean. Help get it into more communities, more schools. But I wanted to ask you first, do you think Dylan would be comfortable with that? Given our history, Marcus thought about it, considering the complexity of such a gesture. I think you should ask him yourself. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Evelyn laughed softly, a sound of recognition and maybe relief. You're right. I should. That's exactly what I should do. For what it's worth, Marcus added, I think he'd be grateful, and I think it would mean a lot coming from you. More than from anyone else. We'll see, Evelyn said. Thank you, Marcus, for everything you've done for all of us. They hung up, and Marcus sat in the quiet of his living room, Kai's head resting on his knee, the dog's warmth seeping through his jeans. He thought about this strange winding path that had brought them all. Heratraphy. Stop a dog's instinct, a woman's decision to look back at the harm done in her name. A man's attempt to turn his worst mistake into something constructive. None of it erased the original harm. Evelyn had still been kidnapped, still carried that trauma. Dylan had still committed a serious crime, still deserved the consequences. But they'd found ways to move forward that honored the complexity of what had happened, that refused to reduce anyone to their worst moment or their highest achievement. And maybe, Marcus thought, stroking Kai's soft ears, that was the best any of them could hope for. Not perfection, not absolution, just the willingness to keep trying, to keep reaching towards something better. 5 years after that October morning when everything changed, Marcus stood at the edge of a community center parking lot, watching a group of teenagers file into the building. They moved with the self-conscious energy of adolescents, some confident, others withdrawn, all carrying invisible weights that no one else could see. They were there for a workshop on conflict resolution and emotional awareness, parts of the program Dylan had developed, now being piloted in 12 cities across the state. Evelyn's foundation had provided the substantial funding needed to make it a reality. Local organizations had provided the infrastructure, the connections, the ground-level knowledge of what each community needed. And Dylan, still serving his sentence, but eligible for parole in 18 months, had provided the framework, the curriculum, the hard-won wisdom that came from making a terrible mistake and choosing to learn from it rather than being destroyed by it. It wasn't a perfect solution. Marcus knew that. Some participants would engage fully, would take the tools offered and use them to build better lives. Others would resist, would dismiss the workshops as pointless or preachy. Some would take the lessons to heart and still fail, still make mistakes, because change was hard and life was complicated. Others would forget everything by next week. Their attention pulled back to the immediate crises of survival, but it was a chance, a possibility. A door opened where one hadn't existed before. And in Marcus's experience, that was often enough. Kai was gone now. The dog had passed away peacefully 2 years earlier, at home, with Marcus beside him, stroking his graying muzzle and telling him he'd been the best partner anyone could ask for. The loss had been devastating in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. He'd known it would hurt, had prepared himself as much as anyone can, but the emptiness left behind was profound. Kai had been more than a partner. He'd been a presence, a constant, a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply pay attention to what others missed. Marcus had taken a month off work after Kai's death, something he'd never done before in his entire career. He'd spent the time walking through parks and trails where they'd trained together, thinking, remembering, allowing himself to grieve fully. And when he'd returned to duty, he'd done so with a new canine partner, a German shepherd named Iris, who was sharp, enthusiastic, and completely her own dog. She had her own personality, her own quirks, her own way of working. She wasn't Kai, but she didn't need to be. Each partnership was unique. Each dog brought something different. Iris was teaching him new things, just as he was teaching her. Inside the community center, Marcus could see the workshop facilitator setting up. The facilitator was a woman named Angela Rodriguez, a former social worker who had lost her younger brother to gang violence when she was 25. That loss had reoriented her entire life, had driven her to dedicate herself to preventing others from following the same path. She was fierce, compassionate, and unflinchingly honest in ways that teenagers responded to. She didn't condescend to them, didn't pretend their problems were simple or that solutions were easy. The teenagers respected her in a way they didn't respect most adults, perhaps because she earned that respect through her own suffering and her refusal to let that suffering make her bitter. Marcus had met Angela through the program. She'd reviewed Dylan's curriculum early on, had made sharp, insightful suggestions that strengthened it considerably, and had eventually become one of its strongest advocates. She'd also told Marcus, in no uncertain terms, that the program's value didn't erase Dylan's crime, but it also didn't need to. People were complicated. Actions had consequences. Harm was real and lasting, and sometimes the best you could do was acknowledge all those truths simultaneously and keep moving forward anyway, refusing to let complexity become an excuse for inaction. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Evelyn. "Are you at the workshop?" "Just outside," he replied, his fingers moving quickly over the screen. "Come say hello when you're done." "I'm inside." Marcus smiled and walked toward the entrance. He found Evelyn in the back of the room, sitting quietly in one of the folding chairs, watching the teenagers settle into their seats. She looked older, her hair completely silver now, styled simply no longer the carefully maintained color it had been 5 years ago. But there was a lightness to her posture that hadn't been there before, an ease in how she held herself. The trauma hadn't disappeared. Trauma never really did, but she'd learned to carry it differently, to integrate it into who she was, rather than letting it consume her. "They don't know who you are, do they?" Marcus said quietly, sitting beside her. Evelyn shook her head, a slight smile playing at her lips. "No, and I prefer it that way. I'm not here as Evelyn Carrington, wealthy philanthropist. I'm just here to observe, to see if the money is being well spent, if this work is actually reaching the people it needs to reach, and—" Marcus prompted. "It is," Evelyn said, her eyes not leaving the front of the room where Angela was arranging materials on a table. "Angela is remarkable. The curriculum is solid, and the kids, some of them, are listening. Really listening. You can see it in their faces, the way they lean forward, the questions they ask. That's all you can ask for, really. Not that you'll reach everyone, but that you'll reach someone. They sat in comfortable silence as the workshop began. Angela started with a deceptively simple question. What makes you angry? The teenagers responded tentatively at first, testing the waters, unsure if this was a safe space or just another adult trying to manipulate them. But Angela's steady presence, her obvious sincerity, gradually opened them up. School, parents, feeling disrespected, feeling invisible, watching people they loved struggle to put food on the table while others seemed to have everything handed to them, being judged before anyone knew their story, police harassment, racism, poverty. The list grew longer, more honest, more raw. Angela listened without judgment, writing their responses on a whiteboard in her clear, bold handwriting, validating each contribution with a nod or a quiet, "Thank you for sharing that." Then she asked, "And what do you do with that anger?" The room quieted. The energy shifted from the relative safety of naming grievances to the harder territory of acknowledging their own responses, their own agency in how they handled difficult emotions. A few kids shrugged, unwilling to admit anything. One boy, maybe 15, wearing a hoodie despite the warm room, said nothing good. Angela nodded, her expression serious but not condemning. That's what we're here to talk about, because anger isn't the problem. Anger is information. It tells you something matters to you, that you curry, that you've been hurt, or that you see injustice. The question isn't whether you should be angry sometimes. Anger is completely appropriate, completely justified. The question is what you do with that information, whether you let it control you, push you toward actions you'll regret, or whether you learn to control it, channel it, use it to fuel change instead of destruction. She paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with as many kids as she could. I was angry when my brother died, furious at the world, at God, at the people who killed him, at myself for not being able to protect him. And that anger almost destroyed me. I wanted to hurt someone the way I'd been hurt, but then I had to ask myself, would that bring him back? Would it make anything better? Or would it just create more pain, more loss, more families grieving? The room was completely silent now. Marcus glanced at Evelyn. She was watching intently, her hands folded in her lap, her face reflecting complex emotions, recognition, pain, understanding. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she saw Dylan in these kids, whether she saw herself in Angela's story of grief and rage, and the choice to transform it into something constructive. After the workshop ended, teens lingering to talk with Angela, asking questions, some exchanging phone numbers to stay connected, Marcus and Evelyn walked outside together. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. The air had that particular quality of early evening, cool and clear, full of possibility. "Do you ever hear from him?" Evelyn asked as they walked slowly toward the parking area. "Dylan," Marcus nodded. "Occasionally. He writes. Asks about the program, about whether it's making a difference, about what feedback we're getting from the facilitators and participants. I tell him the truth at it. Too early to know for sure what the long-term impact will be, but that it's reaching people, that it's giving them tools they wouldn't have had otherwise. That's worth something." "Does he ask about me?" Evelyn's voice was quiet, almost tentative. Sometimes, what do you tell him? That you're doing good work, that you're trying to make things right, that you're stronger than you were. Evelyn smiled faintly, an expression that held both sadness and something like peace. I did write to him, you know, after that first letter he sent through his attorney. We've exchanged a few letters over the years. Nothing profound or philosophical, just acknowledgments that we're both still here, that we're both still trying to be better than our worst moments, that forgiveness is complicated and may be impossible, but that understanding might be achievable. Marcus looked at her, genuinely surprised. I didn't know that. I didn't tell anyone. It felt private, sacred, almost. But I thought you should know. She paused, choosing her words carefully. He's a complicated person. What he did was inexcusable. I still have nightmares sometimes, still feel panic in closed spaces. But he's also trying to be better, and I think that matters. I think we have to believe that matters, or what hope is there for any of us? It does matter, Marcus agreed. Growth matters. Change matters, not as an excuse or an erasure, but as a reality. They stood in the parking lot as the teenagers streamed out of the building, their voices carrying across the space, laughing, talking, returning to their lives. Some of them would remember the workshop, some wouldn't. But they'd all been given a chance to see their anger differently, to understand that they had choices, that they weren't defined solely by their circumstances or their worst impulses, that who they became was, at least partly, up to them. Marcus thought about the hand on the glass 5 years ago, about the moment Kai had stopped and refused to move, his instincts screaming that something was wrong, about all the small decisions that had led them here, his decision to trust his dog as judgment over his own assumptions. Evelyn Est's decision to look back at the harm done in her name and take responsibility for her role in systems of injustice. Dylan Est's decision to take responsibility for his actions and try to transform his understanding into something that might help others. None of it had been easy. None of it had been clean or simple or satisfying in the way stories were supposed to be, but it had been real, and in the end, that was what mattered. Not the headlines that had long since faded, not the verdict that was now just another file in the courthouse archives, but the quiet, persistent work of trying to do better, one choice at a time, one person at a time, one workshop at a time. Evelyn touched his arm gently, her hand light but warm. Thank you, Marcus, for everything, for seeing me that day when I thought I'd become invisible, for treating Dylan like a person instead of just a criminal, for being willing to believe that people can change, for helping make all of this possible. Marcus Nadad, feeling the weight and gift of her words. Thank you for proving it's possible, for showing that wealth and power can be used to heal instead of just accumulate, for doing the hard work of looking at uncomfortable truths. She smiled, and for a moment they just stood there in the gathering darkness, two people who had been brought together by violence and had chosen to respond with something else, something harder, something better, something that required more courage than vengeance ever did. Evelyn walked to her car, and Marcus watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing down the street. Then he climbed into his cruiser, where Iris waited, tail wagging enthusiastically at his return. "Let's go home, girl!" The dog barked once, sharp and clear and full of joy, and Marcus pulled out onto the road. The sun had set completely. Now, the sky deepening into shades of purple and blue, stars beginning to emerge. The world was dark, but not empty. There were lights in windows, cars on the road, people moving through their lives, carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own moments of grace and failure and everything in between. Marcus thought about all of them, the visible and the invisible, the ones who'd been saved and the ones still waiting to be seen, the ones who'd made terrible mistakes and the ones trying to make amends, the ones who'd been hurt and the ones trying to heal, all of them connected in ways they'd never fully understand, all of them part of the same complex, beautiful, broken world. And he thought about Kai, wherever dogs went when they left this world, and hoped the old partner knew that his instinct had mattered, that his refusal to walk away had saved a life, and in saving that life had changed so many others, that his legacy wasn't just in the arrest statistics or the commendations, but in the ripples that continued to spread outward, touching people who would never know his name. The road stretched ahead, dark and winding, full of possibility and danger and everything between. Marcus drove forward, 1 mile at a time, Iris beside him, the weight of the badge on his chest, a reminder of what he'd chosen to do with his own life, to see Purple, to listen, to care when it would be easier not to believe in the possibility of change even when cynicism felt safer. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't always rewarding. There were days when it felt futile, when the suffering seemed endless, when the small victories felt insignificant against the weight of all that was broken. But it was necessary. And on the good days, the days when everything aligned just right, when a teenager stayed after a workshop to ask questions or a dog ate, instinct prevented a tragedy or a person chose growth over bitterness, it was enough. Marcus turned on the radio, letting the low hum of music fill the cruiser, and kept driving into the night, into whatever came next, ready for the calls that would come, the lives that would intersect with his, the chances to make a difference that might present themselves, ready to see what others missed, ready to trust his instincts and his partners, both human and canine, ready to believe, despite everything, that people mattered and that trying to help them mattered, and that the world could be, moment by moment, choice by choice, incrementally better. The road unwound before him, and Marcus followed it home.